For this next assignment, which will you may or may not finish today, that's okay if it's not 100% completed, but we're going to be practicing face duplication or body replacement. So we'll either take our face and put it on someone else's body, or we'll just add our entire selves into a new image. So go ahead and open up your images that you want to work with. Obviously, the more similar your two images are to begin with, the easier job you're going to have. I think the ones that I picked for an example, I probably would advise against, just because they're not the most intuitively similar. We have this young man here and this old guy here, and we're going to try to put his face onto this image. So that's why we're going to do some things with skin tone changing and things like that, giving a rather extreme example. Anything with a lot of hair like this, a lot of facial hair, and very different skin tones is pretty much a nightmare scenario for you to work with, but hopefully all of you will have, you can use some of these techniques that we'll use in this difficult image and apply it to your hopefully easier ones. How's everybody feeling in terms of, you kind of remember, do we need a brief refresher on masking? I know that was a whole week ago, so we'll probably start off with that, I guess. So what I did, we'll go over some brief selection and masking techniques here. So if I wanted to quickly select this man's face, it makes sense that I would use the quick selection tool, which is up here. Looks like a little brush under my lasso. And I can just click and drag, and the computer will mostly guess what I'm trying to select. I can add by holding Shift. Whoops, I got all of it. And remember, at this part, I definitely want to grab more rather than less of his face. So see how right now it keeps trying, when I try to get this darker part here, Photoshop is getting a little bit confused because the shadow part of his skin is so similar to the color of his hood that it just thinks that I'm trying to select the whole thing. So I can go in with a little bit more detail work with my lasso tool. And what do I hold to add to my selection? Yes. And I can just do this little corner by hand, or do a little bit under his hood by hand. And notice I'm not really freaking out about getting everything perfect. I have plenty of stuff that I'll probably be cutting later. But in this phase, it's okay to have more rather than less. I'll give it a nice wide berth. That way I have something to work with. Then I'll copy it using Command C. For this, in this case, Command J is duplicate, so that's close. But we just want to copy it this time, and we'll paste it into this section with Command V. Now, whenever you have done this part, you're probably realizing that the images are pretty different sizes. You know, it may start off like this big or things like that. And so rather than just trying to eyeball it and see how you can just kind of guess, to take some of the guesswork out, we can use our opacity function here on the right to give us a better estimate. So if I take the opacity down of that layer, I can kind of see through it. And this allows me to match things up, key features like the eyes or the nose. See how I can kind of see both images now? I can align the nose more perfectly. And already it almost kind of looks a little bit more believable. You see some of his wrinkles and stuff coming through, and it's kind of merging the two faces. But I can use that to kind of get a good placement of size and approximation of location for where I want his face. So that's pretty good for me. And then after I do that, I can just take the opacity right back up to 100%. All right, so now we have a good approximate size. I want to start working with some masking elements. Now, a brief reintroduction of masking. Remember, our masking button is down here under our layers. It looks like the rectangle with the little circle on it. Clicking that will add a new layer mask, and I have this white frame that pops up that's linked to that layer. this is my mask that I can paint on with either black or white to hide or reveal certain parts of that layer. So if I wanted to hide this section of his clothes that I accidentally selected here, I could go in, I have my mask created. Notice there's a difference between this button and this button. If I click here on the layer, I actually paint on the image itself. This is bad news. This actually paints black. That's not what I want. So anytime you start seeing black or white actually appear on your picture, back it up a little bit, Command Z, Control Z to undo, and make sure that you're on the right layer and that you're actually on the mask. So I actually click this mask thumbnail. Now when I use that same stroke, it's not black, it actually just hides what I want to hide. I can use that then to go in nice and tight and get rid of his part of his hoodie. Now when you're doing facial replacement with something like this, you have two basic options. One is, and this kind of, you make this decision based on skin tone and the way the faces are looking and things like that. One option is that you try to match it up just perfectly so it's almost like your face is a mask that the other person is wearing. So it's all your skin tone, it's all your eyes and your features and things like that, and it just tries to perfectly cover up where their face is. If your facial shape and things like that align just right, and you can do that, that's probably the easiest way to do it, so go for it. If not though, like you'll see just the proportions of these two guys' faces are much different, so I'm gonna have to figure out new ways to do this. The other option, aside from the straight up mask approach, is a little trickier, and if it's done poorly, it can look mega creepy, but that's okay, because we want to do it right. It's where you actually erase essentially all of your skin tone, or you mask it rather, so you're hiding all of your skin tone so that the other person's skin tone shows through, and you're keeping your features. So just a really rough approximation of what that would look like would be like something along the lines of this. You can kind of see how it's starting to form here. We'd have to align it a little bit better so that the eyebrows really carried over and things like that. But you retain the details of what identifies you as a person, like your eyes, the shape of your nose, the shape of your mouth. It already looks really unsettling. But that's the 30-second version. So then once you get that, you can use things like our clone stamp tool that we'll go over here in more detail in a bit to match things like skin tone and texture. You'll clean up the edges of your mask a little bit better so it really gets right up underneath your eyelid, and you're really blending the two pictures. So one is basically you're just kind of covering them up, and the other one is more kind of a meshing together of the two faces. It's really your call in terms of which technique you want to try. You could just have two different layers where you're trying both at the same time and see which one looks better. But yeah, give it a shot and be at least sizing your things up and see if you can decide which one you think is going to work for you. I'll walk around and see how it's going to turn out. So for that one, if you look at my mask, instead of having a mask that just completely outlines their face, it looks more almost like a skeleton picture kind of.
Okay.
So you can see I'll have just gotten rid of all the parts that I want to hide, and I've left the main features visible.
Okay.
So what I would do then is,
How did you do that to the new mask one?
okay, what I have my rough cutout face.
Yeah.
I started a mask here.
Right.
Let's well, I'll just do it again for you here. Okay, so what I did was I got onto my mask.
On the mask.
I have my black color out, and I have my paintbrush,
And you brush.
and I basically just go in and paint everything except the main features. So I keep the eyes fine.
Yeah.
and go through that way. Now, a trick is you can actually change the opacity just of your brush up here. See at the top here?
Okay.
Is it like?
I can take the opacity of my brush down to say 50% or so.
So no one really wants
Yeah.
everyone.
And when I start painting, it kind of half erases. So you see, it's not fully changing it, but the skin tone is already changing.
I was working with Kevin.
So this way, it actually allows me to half see the original guy's face and half see the old guy's face.
Right.
So this allows things like skin texture to show through, and it's going to blend them much more readily than just completely erasing one over the other.
Okay.
Did everybody catch that? I'll go over it one more time because it's kind of a useful tool. So we've all done masking before, and that's useful for, hiding something and revealing another. But there's a trick that we can use to make things blend really well. So if I go up here, notice, I don't know if we ever did a general breakdown of your Photoshop window, but in general, the tools will be on the left, as you all know, layers and things like that. Other optional windows will be on the right. But what we didn't say is that tool-specific options, like if I want to change the size of my brush or how opaque or transparent my brush is, for any different tool, are up here along the top. So not only do I have opacity and blend modes for my layers, but I also have them for each individual tool. So if I have my paintbrush out and I change the opacity up here instead of right here, notice this one, since it's right above the layers, affects the opacity of the entire layer. This opacity meter, since it's up with things about my particular tool, which is the brush, changes it just for that tool. So when I go in and start painting black to hide this guy's face, it's only going to paint like 50% black. So this semi hides it, but you see how I can kind of like see the old man's skin texture come through now? So I'm seeing not 100% his face and not 100% the old guy's face, but an amalgam of the two. That already off the bat looks much, much, much more believable.
Yeah, it does.
And then for some things like the hard edges here that I don't like, I could go back and have it be full 100% strength and soften it up that way. So what I'd like you guys all to do now is just take a brief break from masking. Focus up for like 10 minutes or so as I fly through this, and then we'll jump right back in. I just wanted to, like I said, we'll post this up also in resources on the courses site so that you guys can have it as reference. But I did want to just go through it with you real quick, show you a couple tips and tricks of how Photoshop and PowerPoint can work together and make you look awesome during your next presentation. So the main difference that's going to make all your presentations stand out from others, especially now that you have this Photoshop knowledge, is that if you use visual cues in your presentation, it's going to be 10,000% better right off the bat. Templates and everything are great for people who can barely turn on a computer, but you guys now can kind of expect a little bit more of yourselves, start making things from scratch, start working with some better backgrounds and things like that. With all these new tools you have at your disposal. So, for instance, just using full screen, high quality images, like the things that we grab from Stock Exchange, already grabs your audience's attention right off the bat. You can also use transparency changes, kind of like how I just did between these two, to kind of retain that initial attention grab, but then still have it be light enough so that your text is legible. That's like a really easy trick to use without changing gears too much. If you just hear a piece of information, if I got up here and was just talking to you, you'd remember about 10% of what I said 3 days later. If I just showed you a picture of it, you'd remember about 35, which is a much better jump, but that's still, not very much. If you have both that auditory and visual though, like if you're using really good visuals and you're talking about and describing the visuals to the audience, you jump up to 65% retention. For any piece of information 3 days later, that's pretty good. It's certainly a lot better than the 10% most people would get just from like zombie staring at your wall of text PowerPoints that everyone in this room I'm sure has sat through. Pictures also beat text as well because reading is actually very inefficient for our brains. We're very visual creatures, and so the way that reading actually is broken down in our mind is that we see each individual letter form as an image or a symbol that is representative of whatever word it's representative. So you actually see the letter forms DOG and you're thinking of an image of a dog in your head, but that whole process takes time. So if I showed you a picture of a dog and I started talking about a dog and then I had the word dog on the screen, that's when you get that 65% range of retention. Really drives it home much easier. So using some of these graphic design tips that we're talking about. This is definitely verging more into like the design versus just straight up PowerPoint, but the two can often be used together to make things even better. JustAlt is a school of psychology of thought that actually went back and studied like why some layouts are more effective in our brains, like how our brains actually are hardwired to interpret visual images and what makes one effective and what makes one less effective. And it came up with these 5 main principles. The first is the element of closure. So anytime you see a partial image, your mind is going to want to try to complete it. So say you're doing a PowerPoint and you have an image of Washington crossing the Delaware, something that probably everyone has seen at least at some point in middle school history. If you cut out the image of Washington and with your Photoshop masking skills and have like a piece of something that your audience was expecting to see and it's gone, that's going to grab their attention much more than just showing them that image because their brain is trying to attempt this element of closure. Proximity tells us that whenever our eye sees something that are close together, it will mentally associate them as a group. So here, instead of seeing a bunch of different squares, you actually see the letter E because of how close they are together. This is most obvious in PowerPoints when you have like a list of pros and cons. You don't ever go pro, do-do-do, con, do-do-do, pro, con. You usually have like a column of all the pros on one side and a column of all the cons on the other. This is that principle of proximity in action. Continuation is moving the eye of a viewer along a steady curve. So when you lay out things in your image, if you have like a central point of information that you want to convey, say at the bottom right corner, you can kind of lead them visually either with the types of images you choose, cheesily with arrows, which I don't recommend doing, but anything that can kind of get that eye to follow a certain path is also more effective than just throwing the information up on the screen. Similarity tells us that whenever we see objects that are similar, we're always looking for repeated visual patterns in our mind. So you can use that both by showing like a repeated symbol or repeated curve or repeated phrase over and over again. Again, kind of the whole repetition thing is pretty obvious to everybody here. Will make it more effective. The thing that makes it different here is that we can do that visually. So instead of just saying the same bullet point 3 times in a row, based on your design and the images you choose, anything that has like a similar or repeated curve or line or graphic will be more effective. The final one, which probably applies least to our PowerPoints, but is the coolest looking when it comes to logo design, is figure ground. That's the principle where you kind of have this ambiguous relationship between what is the figure in front of the picture and what is the background. There's kind of like an aha moment where at first from maybe far away and you squint your eyes a little bit, you just kind of see the outline of the A and the L. But then when you get up closer or you unsquint your eyes, you can see the background is actually like a lady putting things on the Christmas tree. Using hierarchy for your slides is great for illustrating different levels of importance. So if you do need to cram a lot of text on a slide, which I'll probably say a million times not to do during this presentation, this is the way you got to do it. The bigger, the bolder, the brighter it is, the more our eye is going to be drawn to it. Likewise, we're also going to start on the top left, pretty much by default, anytime you see a page, just because that's how we read in Western culture. You can see here, though, we also kind of subtly used a little bit of continuation by having the dotted lines kind of control your eye. You'll notice that the point of the triangle like kind of reinforces that to point you right to the next dotted line to go down to 3, and then you end up on the final line reading hierarchy. So a lot of this stuff is really just background information. It's nothing that any of your viewers would consciously be like, I love how you pointed that triangle to that dotted line. It really guided my eye. That's just going to happen kind of in the back of their heads. But if they walk away from your presentation and those 3 points stick out more than it would have if you hadn't laid it out that way, you'll know why. Fonts. Using fonts in your presentation is really, really great, and it's something that most people pay almost no attention to. 90% of all your presentations that you see are probably going to be in whatever default font comes up. Fonts in themselves can actually convey a ton of different tones. Please stay clear of overused ones like Comic Sans. Anytime I teach a class, I just want to throttle a student anytime they use that font. I have entire sections of my typography lesson that are dedicated to like telling you why this is such a terrible choice. Papyrus is also another one that's like started off, at least that one started off good. It's a neat looking stylized font. It's just overused, which is why people don't like it now. But this is a great link that you can use. Defont.com has an amazing database of free fonts to use. It has very, very clear instructions of how to install them on both Mac and PCs. It's really just a couple of double clicks, and all of a sudden, all your Photoshop, all your PowerPoint, all your Illustrator, everything has all those things all together, and they're ready to use. So highly recommend that. The general takeaway, like probably the 2 main things I want you to learn though from this is that 1, use lots more graphics instead of text to be representing your ideas. Basically, the PowerPoint should just be up there to be kind of giving strength to your presentation. It's not the presentation. I pray that you're not just reading text up on the screen. That's like, please don't ever do that. So really, this should just be the background to you. They should be listening to you, and this should be kind of strengthening your points rather than just being all of your points up there. So what I recommend doing is using more slides with less text to be more effective. Because when you get walls of text like this, your audience just instantly zones out. You may read the first like 5 or 6 words, and if you're really stubborn, you may stick it out to the end, but if you have a 30 or 45-minute presentation like this, no one's going to remember anything. So simplicity is really key. Animation, I'll go over a couple different things real quick with you. Some people, unfortunately, when they learn, oh my goodness, PowerPoint is animation is the best thing ever. I'm going to send everything flying around. Don't want to do that. There's definitely such a thing as too much of a good thing. And sometimes when people learn about the animation in PowerPoint, they can definitely go to the extreme. Things to keep in mind, though, is that if you're ever going to post this to make this as a downloadable resource, either through SlideShare, which is a site we can talk about in a little bit, or just through courses or Dropbox or whatever collaboration tool you're going to be distributing this with. 1, even if you send the original PowerPoint, which I probably don't recommend doing, I recommend probably making it a PDF so no one can really change your work. If you do send the original PowerPoint, when most people are at home reviewing their notes or reviewing your presentation, they're probably not going to be in full screen. And if you notice, when you're not in full screen in PowerPoint, none of the animations play because it doesn't think that you're in like presentation mode. So if you spend all this time trying to get a bunch of cool animations in there and people aren't even looking at it on their own full screen, then that's kind of all out. Same thing, if you do save it in PDF format and email it that way to save on file size, all the animation is going to be lost anyways. Now that doesn't mean that animation's bad. It can definitely strengthen a live presentation, but you may want to consider making kind of like almost a duplicate presentation without the animation in for distributing through email or PDF. So a couple good examples of how to use animation correctly. If you have an interesting title slide, which is some really subtle information at the first, it can kind of be a good way to grab people's attention right off the bat. You can use it to illustrate how pieces fit into a whole. So for this one, we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, and we would shrink the pyramid at the top and kind of go line by line and show you how each different section fit into this kind of building pyramid approach. You can use it to illustrate transitions. So this was a piece that we're talking about going from old to the new, kind of like books to internet in libraries. You can use it to rethink bullet points. Again, the whole thing about not having too much text on the screen, never have more than, if you have to have any bullet points at all, which you can definitely get around doing by using these cool visual tricks, keep it really, really minimal. Again, more slides with less information on each slide is much easier to process than those giant walls of 50 bullet points or a whole wall of text. So This was a presentation we did about brain facts and using Photoshop to colorize this black and white image that I found online. You can illustrate bullet points by having like different neurons fire and kind of illustrate it that way, which is much more visually eye-catching than just, hey, it weighs about 3 pounds and it feels like tofu if you squish it. Same thing here, just like a really subtle information, taking like a central word from whatever bullet point you want, in this case collect, and then kind of animating it in one by one, line at a time, makes it a little bit more memorable than just clicking through and here's 3 bullet points. Next slide. The last version of bullet points that I like are just really well spaced numbered bullet points. Keeping it very minimal in text because you're going to be the one illustrating the points. These are just backing you up. A quick thing we can talk about removing a background with PowerPoint. We all learned how to do this with masks in Photoshop, but thankfully newer versions of PowerPoint do have an abbreviated, much weaker tool to do this with. I'll just show you how to do it really quick. First of all, it's only going to work on ideal images like this, where you have like a solid color background. If you wanted to just isolate a person from a crowd in a photograph, this is not going to cut it. This is like the very gimped, like 2-year-old cousin of Photoshop in terms of masking ability. If I click the image and say format the picture, I get a couple of these different options here. Clicking remove background will show me in kind of magenta everything that it thinks I want to remove. If I resize this little bounding box here so I don't clip off the corners of my leaf, you can notice it's smart enough to get all the background in one go. If I then click, it's all gone. However, and then it also has a couple of things where you can add by like actually clicking here. I can kind of like trace little points around sections that I don't want to add. But like I said, if it doesn't get it all in one go, pretty much right off the bat, don't bother. It's great for really simple things like that. Like if you pull a Google image search and you just have some white backgrounds that you're going to get rid of right away, that's great. Anything more complex than that though, definitely head over to Photoshop, bust out your masking tools that you're all pros at now, and knock it out that way. The good thing about using all these high quality images that we can find in Stock Exchange is that they all look really great. You kind of have to keep that in mind though if you have a solid deck full of 50 pages of all like 2 meg, 3 meg pictures each. It can get a little unwieldy, so definitely make sure that you keep that in mind. If they are getting really big, you may want to open them in Photoshop first and go save for web and devices. That'll give you these options that we kind of briefly talked about. You guys remember JPEGs, GIFs, and PNGs at all? We have a handy dandy chart as soon as Photoshop's or PowerPoint's done crashing on us here that I can show you. PNGs were basically images that functioned almost like a JPEG but could remember transparent backgrounds. JPEGs are the ones that you'll see all over the place, but they can't remember transparency. If you make one with transparency and then save it as a JPEG, it just fills it in with white as default, undoing all of your hard work. GIFs can do a little bit of everything except what JPEGs can do. So they don't show photographs very well. They do better with a simple lower number of colors like in illustrations, but they also do get the added bonus of being able to remember animation, which is something you can do in Photoshop, but that's a lesson for another time. So, like I said, be aware of the size of the images you use. Don't scale images up too high, meaning if you find only really small ones online, even with holding shift to keep them in proportion, a really pixelated image that's perfectly in proportion is going to look just as bad. So don't do that too much. You guys, there's a couple of hot linked images here websites here besides Stock Exchange. There's certain portions of Flickr and free range that are great for more resources for finding free images. Stock Exchange is simple though because pretty much everything you find is free to use, and probably 90% of that is free to use even commercially if you wanted. Flickr, you have to be very specific in what kind of search terms and where on the site that you're looking, but there is still a lot, especially vintage photography. If you want some really like old school, like 60s and 70s vibe, like Instagram before Instagram existed, like Flickr has a ton of that stuff. So that's a great way to find some of these images. But does anybody have any questions?
Are those royalty free, the ones on Flickr?
It'll depend. Flickr has a handy guide to tell you with a couple different symbols, like what's free to use, what you need to ask permission to use, and what is commercially free to use.
A lot of people use Creative Commons.
Yeah.
Annotation also.
That's one of the best. I think that's where this actually links to, is the Creative Commons portion of Flickr. But that's all we have for PowerPoint. So now hopefully you've got a ton of this masking stuff. You got a ton of coloration, a couple different tricks in Photoshop. Now you can see a couple different ways to actually apply that into PowerPoint to make those two work even better together. And you're set for a whole new different way to present things. So I'm really glad you guys got to sign up for this class. For the remaining half hour or so, I'm be happy to help you with anything on your masking assignment, or if you're making a greeting card for Christmas, or if you have a PowerPoint question, anything like that. I'd love to help you out, and my cubicle door is always open. Because
Literally.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.